Plasma scorched Gary's face as he dived through the shattered window, shielding the terrified Ulian girls with his body. A muffled wail pierced the smoke. Gary's stomach churned. The rebels screamed as government forces butchered them outside. "Come on, we need to get the hell out," Gary shouted. He peeked through the blown-out wall. Rebel bodies littered the school grounds. Green blood splattered over the playground. Spiker huddled in the corner, clutching a data drive, her 6 arms wrapped protectively around a trio of trembling younglings. Gary had been embedded with the rebel forces for months, documenting their desperate struggle. The Alien Civil War had raged for a decade, devastating the once thriving planet. Billions had perished in the conflict. Millions more languished in refugee camps, slowly starving. The galactic community had abandoned Ulia, writing it off as a lost cause. Only a handful of human aid workers and journalists like Gary remained. "Take them! Get to the tunnels!" Spiker yelled, antennae twitching as explosions rocked the building. She gestured frantically at the younglings. "I'm not leaving you," Gary protested. "You have to. I need to destroy the data center. It's the only way to keep our plans safe. If they discover what we're doing, we're all dead." Gary hesitated. He had grown close to Spiker over the long months of fighting. She was like a little sister to him, but he knew she was right. The data couldn't fall into enemy hands. "Stay safe, I'll get them out," Gary relented. He scooped up the wailing younglings, their mucus smearing his jacket. Spiker nodded grimly, then sprinted down the flame-lit hallway, data drive clutched to her chest. Gary herded the girls to the back of the school. He pried open a rusted hatch, revealing a cramped maintenance tunnel. The boom of artillery grew louder. Screams echoed from above as the school collapsed in a gout of green fire. Gary hustled the younglings into the duct. They crawled through the tight passages, pointy rocks jabbing their skin. Up ahead, shafts of orange light pierced the darkness. Gary kicked out a grate, and they clambered into the open. The once vibrant city was reduced to rubble. Smoke choked the sky. Ulians thronged the streets, desperately searching for a way off-world. In the distance, ships blasted into the heavens, fleeing the doomed planet. At the spaceport, guards fired plasma rifles into the crowd, cutting down anyone who got too close. Gary's heart pounded. There was no escape. He and the girls would die forgotten on this hellish rock like all the others. The ground suddenly shook. A shadow fell over the spaceport. Gary looked up to see a fleet of battered human warships dropping out of null space. The alien crowd fell silent. A voice crackled over the comms. "Attention, citizens of Ulia. This is Admiral Jackson of the United Earth Defense Forces. We have come to render aid and assistance. Any and all refugees are now under the protection of the United Earth Defense Forces. Attacks against civilians will not be tolerated," Admiral Jackson declared, his voice booming across the cityscape. The Ulian soldiers hesitated, unsure how to respond to this unexpected turn of events. Their commanders barked orders to stand their ground, but the human fleet looming overhead gave them pause. The humans didn't wait for a response. Precision beam weapons lanced out from the orbiting warships, surgically disabling the government's artillery and heavy weaponry. Explosions rippled across the spaceport as the big guns fell silent. Dropships roared down from the skies, disgorging squads of heavily armed human marines. They quickly established a perimeter around the spaceport, pushing back the government troops. Civilians cheered as the Marines herded them to safety, away from the lines of fire. A sleek medical frigate emblazoned with the UEDF insignia descended on vectored thrusters, touching down on the scorched landing pad. Ramps lowered, and medical personnel in crisp white uniforms rushed out, triaging the hundreds of wounded Ulians. The alien doctors, overwhelmed and exhausted, gladly accepted the assistance. Gary stumbled towards a marine checkpoint, the Ulian younglings huddled around him. The girls were wide-eyed with fear and confusion. One had fallen asleep in Gary's arms, too tired and traumatized to stay awake. The guards, hardened veterans who had seen countless battles, cracked a smile at the sight. They waved him through, pointing him towards a large tent with refugee processing stenciled on the side. Inside the dimly lit tent, Gary was surprised to find a human woman in a Navy uniform directing the operation with brisk efficiency. She introduced herself as Lieutenant Sarah Novak. Her demeanor softened slightly as she saw the state of the younglings. "Get these girls some blankets and nutrient packs," she ordered a nearby corpsman. "And you," she said, turning to Gary, "I'm going to need you to stay with them for now. Last thing these kids need is to be separated from the only familiar face around." Gary nodded, gently setting the sleeping child down on a cot. As he helped the girls get settled, he couldn't help overhearing a heated argument near the entrance of the tent. Tatidi, Lieutenant Novak, was facing off with an irate Ullian official, flanked by a phalanx of government troops. "Caius, by order of the Provisional Authority, you will turn over all refugees for processing immediately," the official demanded, slamming his fist on the folding table. "I don't think so," Novak replied coolly. "These people are under my protection now. We'll handle the processing and ensure their well-being. If you have a problem with that, you can take it up with the Admiral." The official sputtered with rage, but couldn't seem to find a response. He spun on his heel and stormed out, nearly bowling over a Marine in his haste. Gary felt a wave of relief wash over him as he watched Novak turn back to her duties, a determined set to her jaw. For the first time since he'd arrived on this blasted rock, he felt a glimmer of hope. These humans... Hours later, Gary slumped against a stack of crates in the refugee tent, his muscles aching from hauling supplies. He had been working non-stop to distribute food packs and thermal blankets to the shell-shocked Ullians. The girls were huddled together nearby, nibbling on nutrient bars. Suddenly, a commotion erupted near the entrance flap. Ullians scattered as a blood-soaked rebel staggered into the tent, his arms wrapped around a limp figure. Gary's heart stopped. It was Spiker, her exoskeleton shattered, ichor oozing from brutal wounds. "Help! Please, she needs help!" the rebel shouted, his voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. Gary sprinted over, nearly slipping in the blood pooling at the rebel's feet. He reached out to take Spiker, gasping as he saw the extent of her injuries. Her antennae were snapped off, her compound eyes swollen shut. Ugly burn marks seared her thorax. She was barely breathing. "What happened?" Gary demanded. The rebel sagged to his knees. "The Gov troops, they caught her in the data center, beat her half to death before I could get to her. Didn't want to move her, but the whole place was coming down." Human medics swarmed around them, gently transferring Spiker to a hovering stretcher. They barked orders, prepping an IV line and trauma kit. One of them waved a scanner over Spiker's mangled body, his face grim. "Multiple fractures, internal bleeding, signs of neurological trauma. We need to get her to the ship now." As they rushed Spiker to a waiting shuttle, Gary jogged alongside the stretcher. He couldn't leave her, not after everything they'd been through. She had risked her life for those younglings, for her people. Gary couldn't let her die alone on some nameless battlefield. "I'm coming with you," he insisted as they loaded Spicer into the transport. The medic looked like he wanted to argue, then just nodded curtly. Gary clambered in after them, the hatch slamming shut behind him. The shuttle lifted off with a roar of thrusters, angling up towards the medical frigate in low orbit. Gary clutched Spiker's limp claw, whispering desperate prayers to gods he didn't believe in. Suddenly her eyes fluttered open. She turned her head weakly, antennae twitching. "Gary, the children, are they—" Spiker's voice rattled in her shattered carapace. "They're safe, Spiker. The humans got them out. They're going to be okay," Gary reassured her, blinking back hot tears. Spiker shuddered, her breath coming in short gasps. "You have to protect them. The government, they'll hunt them down. Younglings who survive, they grow up, become rebels." "I won't let that happen, I swear it." Gary squeezed her claw. A faint smile flickered across Spiker's mangled face. Her eyes drifted shut as she slipped back into unconsciousness. Gary held her claw the rest of the way to the ship, silently begging her to hold on. Aboard the medical frigate, Gary paced the gleaming corridor outside the operating theatre. Human and Ulian doctors had rushed Spica into surgery the moment they landed, shouting about crash carts and transfusions. That had been hours ago. Now he could only wait, praying that their efforts weren't in vain. "Gary?" a voice called softly. He turned to see Lieutenant Novak striding towards him, 2 mugs of steaming coffee in hand. She passed him one, which he accepted gratefully. "Any word?" Novak asked, sipping her drink. Gary shook his head. "Nothing yet. They said her injuries were severe. I don't—" His voice hitched. He didn't want to verbalize the fear gnawing at his gut, that Spica wouldn't survive, that he had failed her, just like he had failed so many others. Novak laid a hand on his shoulder. "She's in good hands, Gary. The docs on this boat are the best we've got. They'll do everything they can for her." Gary nodded, not trusting himself to speak. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the organized chaos of the frigate's medical bay. Orderlies rushed by with crates of supplies, while harried-looking surgeons conferred over datapads. In the distance, Gary could hear the muffled sobs of wounded Ulians. "Why did you come here, Lieutenant?" he asked suddenly. "Why risk your lives for a species that's not even part of your Federation? Most of the galaxy gave up on the Ulians years ago." Novak sighed, her face somber. "We couldn't just stand by and watch anymore, Gary. The reports coming out of Ulia, they were horrific. Mass executions, torture, use of chemical weapons on civilian populations. The government went too far. We had to act." She took another swig of coffee. "Our mission is to provide humanitarian aid and protect the civilians caught in the crossfire. We'll support the rebel cause as much as we can, but we're not here to fight their war for them. Though after what I saw today, I'm starting to wonder if that will be enough." Gary leaned back against the wall, his mind spinning. He had come to Ulia to document the plight of the rebels, to show the galaxy the toll of the government's brutal oppression. But in all his months on the front lines, he had never imagined that salvation might come from above, that there were still those in the universe who gave a damn. For the first time since the school bombing, Gary felt the knot of dread in his chest start to loosen. The road ahead would be long and fraught with danger, but at least now there was a flicker of hope. The humans were here, and they wouldn't abandon Ulia like all the others. The lights in the operating theatre dimmed as the human and Ulian surgeons stepped back, their gloves slick with dark green blood. One of the doctors pulled down her mask, letting out a heavy sigh. "She's stable for now, but the next few hours will be critical." Gary slumped against the wall, his legs nearly giving out from sheer exhaustion and stress. He dragged a shaking hand over his face. Spica had pulled through, barely, but she wasn't out of danger yet. He forced himself to stand, knowing he couldn't stay. The younglings needed him. He had to make sure they were all right. Gary stumbled out of the medical bay, his boots echoing on the metal deck plates. He made his way through the bustling corridors of the frigate, dodging human and Ulian personnel rushing to and fro. The ship was a hive of activity as the relief efforts ramped up. After a dizzying shuttle ride back down to the surface, Gary staggered into the refugee camp. The sun had long since set, leaving the sea of tents illuminated by harsh floodlights. The air smelled of smoke and antiseptic. He found the younglings exactly where he had left them, huddled together on a small cot. But something was wrong. They were shaking, their thin arms wrapped around each other as they wept. Soft, keening wails rose from their throats, a sound of pure anguish. Gary's heart seized in his chest. He knelt down beside them, reaching out to stroke their trembling antennae. Hey, it's all right. I'm here. What happened?" The smallest girl, barely more than a hatchling, turned her swollen eyes up to him. Gone, all gone, Mama, Papa, everyone. The bad soldiers came and—" She broke off with a choked sob, burying her face in her hands. Ice flooded Gary's veins as realization crashed over him. Their families, the rebel stronghold, the government's final, merciless assault. These poor children, they had lost everything, everyone. He gathered them into his arms, holding them close as they cried. Hot tears soaked into his filthy jacket. He murmured soothing words, rocking them gently. But he knew it was futile. No amount of comfort could ease the agony of such a loss. Their lives had been shattered, irrevocably changed. They would carry this pain forever. Gary stayed with them through the long dark hours of the night. He held them until their sobs quieted into exhausted whimpers, until they finally fell into a fitful slumber. He tucked a blanket around their small forms, watching the rise and fall of their chests. They looked so fragile in the harsh light, so vulnerable. Gary's heart ached for them. They had already endured so much, seen horrors no child should ever witness. And now they were alone in the universe, orphans of a brutal war they never asked for. He knew he couldn't fix this, couldn't erase the trauma seared into their young minds, but he swore to himself, to whatever gods might be listening, that he would do everything in his power to protect them, to give them a chance at a better life. That was the least he could do, for Spiker, for their parents, for all the brave Ulians who had fought and bled and died for the dream of freedom. As the sun began to rise over the ruined cityscape, painting the sky in hues of orange and red, Gary finally allowed himself to rest. He slumped down beside the cot, one hand still entwined with a tiny clawed appendage. He closed his burning eyes, praying for strength, for the younglings, for Spiker, for the long, difficult road ahead. They would need every ounce of courage and resilience they possessed to make it through this. But they wouldn't face it alone. The humans were here now, and Gary would be with them every step of the way, no matter how dark the path became. In the days that followed, the human fleet threw itself into the relief efforts with full force. Dropships ferried down crates of food, medicine, and emergency shelters. Engineers erected temporary housing and water purification plants. Medics worked around the clock, treating the sick and wounded, and Gary documented it all, recording hours of footage and interviews. He spoke with shell-shocked civilians, battle-hardened rebels, and stoic human soldiers. He captured the tearful reunions of families torn apart by war and the somber memorial services for the fallen. Through it all, one image stuck with him: a human marine, his face streaked with grime and sweat, cradling an Ulian infant in his burly arms. The child had been orphaned in the fighting, left wailing amidst the rubble. But as the marine gently rocked it, murmuring a lullaby from his own distant childhood, the baby quieted. It gazed up at him with wide, trusting eyes, clutching his armored finger in its tiny claws. In that moment, the barriers of species and culture seemed to melt away. They were just two living beings, reaching out to each other in a time of crisis, finding comfort and connection amidst the chaos. It gave Gary hope. Hope that the humans and the Ulians could forge a new future together, that they could build something good and just from the ashes of this war. He spent long days in the field, chronicling the slowly healing world, but every evening he returned to the field hospital to check on Spisa. She remained unconscious, her ravaged body submerged in a tank of luminous green fluid. The doctors said the regenerative serum was working, knitting her shattered exoskeleton back together cell by cell, but they couldn't say when or if she would wake. So Gary sat by her side, watching the gentle bubbles that danced around her suspended form. He talked to her for hours, telling her about the progress they were making, the new government taking shape, the younglings, and how they were adjusting to life with their adoptive families. He poured out his hopes and fears, his dreams for the future. Sometimes he imagined he saw a flicker behind her translucent eyelids, the twitch of a leg or antennae, but she remained locked in that silent, unresponsive state, deaf to his desperate pleas. Still, he refused to give up on her. Spica was a fighter, a survivor. If anyone could claw their way back from the brink of death, it was her. Weeks bled into months. The Ulian homeworld slowly began to heal, the scars of war fading beneath new growth and construction. The rebel council, with support from the human advisors, drafted a constitution and held elections. For the first time in generations, The Ulian people had a voice in their own governance. The younglings thrived in their new homes, nurtured by the love and support of the rebel community. They started school, made friends, learned to laugh again, but the shadow of grief still lingered in their eyes, a testament to all they had lost. Gary watched them grow, his heart swelling with pride and protectiveness. They were his family now in all the ways that mattered. He would gladly give his life to ensure their happiness and safety. But as the human fleet made preparations to depart, Gary felt a growing sense of unease. His time on Ulia was coming to an end, and with it, his time with Speaker and the younglings. The thought of leaving them behind, of returning to his old life as if nothing had changed, felt like a physical ache in his chest. They had become such an integral part of his world, his very being. How could he possibly say goodbye? He wrestled with the decision for days, torn between his duty to Earth and his love for his adopted family. In the end, there was only one choice he could make. Gary stood before Speaker's tank, his hand pressed against the cool glass. She floated serenely, her features relaxed in repose. The doctors had finally deemed her stable enough to be brought out of the coma. She would wake soon. Part of him longed to stay, to be there when she opened her eyes, but he knew he couldn't put this off any longer. "Speaker, His voice cracked, choked with emotion. "I have to go. The fleet is leaving and I'm needed back on Earth." He swallowed hard, blinking back the moisture that blurred his vision. "But I want you to know I love you. You and the younglings, you're my family, and I will always, always be here for you, no matter how far apart we are." Gary leaned his forehead against the tank, his breath fogging the glass. "You are the strongest, bravest, most incredible person I've ever met. Your people are lucky to have you. They're going to need your wisdom and compassion, now more than ever." A sad smile tugged at his lips. "I know you'll be an amazing leader. You'll help the Ulians build a better world, a future free from fear and oppression, and I'll be watching, cheering you on every step of the way." He placed a small data chip on the ledge of the tank, a message for her to find when she woke. "This isn't goodbye. I'll come back someday, I promise." With a last long look at her peaceful face, Gary turned and walked away. He didn't let himself glance back, knowing if he did, he would never be able to leave. The younglings were waiting for him outside the hospital, their small faces solemn and tearful. They knew what was happening. Gary had explained it to them, as gently as he could. He knelt down, opening his arms. They rushed to him, clinging to his neck and waist and legs. He held them tight, memorizing the feel of them, the scent and warmth and weight. "Be good, okay? Mind your foster parents and look out for each other. Remember what Speaker taught you about courage and kindness and standing up for what's right." The littlest girl sniffled, her antennae drooping. "Will we ever see you again?" Gary cupped her small face in his hands, thumbing away her tears. "Of course you will, sweetheart. This isn't forever. I'll come visit as often as I can, and when you're older you can come to Earth. I'll show you all the wonders of my home world." That brought a watery smile to their faces. Gary hugged them fiercely one last time. "I love you, never forget that." Then he stood, gently untangling himself from their embrace. He shouldered his pack and walked towards the waiting human shuttle, the younglings' soft cries echoing behind him. Every step away from them felt like a knife to the heart, but he kept going, his jaw clenched against the grief that threatened to consume him. This was the right thing to do. Speaker and the younglings, they belonged here on Ulia. This was their world, their future. They would help to shape it, to make it a place of peace and equity and hope. And he belonged on Earth. He had a job to do, a story to tell. The galaxy needed to know what had happened here, the sacrifices that had been made, the bonds that had been forged, the indomitable spirit of a people who refused to surrender, even in the face of impossible odds. Gary boarded the shuttle, strapping himself into a seat by the viewport. As the thrusters engaged and the craft lifted off, he watched the Ulian landscape recede below him. The glittering spires of the capital city, the lush green forests, the shimmering lakes. It was a beautiful world, a brave and resilient world, and part of his heart would always remain here with the family he had found against all odds. As the shuttle breached the atmosphere and the stars filled his view, Gary closed his eyes. He pictured Spica's face, the youngling's bright smiles. He held them close, enshrining them in his memory. Someday, somehow, he would return to them, but until then he would carry their love with him, a shining beacon to guide him through whatever trials lay ahead. For he knew with unshakable certainty that their bond was unbreakable, a testament to the power of compassion, of empathy, of the indomitable spirit that burned within them all. The stars beckoned cold and eternal, but Gary's heart was warm, buoyed by the love and hope that Spica and the younglings had kindled within him. He would see them again, and until then he would keep fighting, for them, for Earth, for the brighter future they all dreamed of. Always. Gary's fingers trembled as he stared down at the cryptic message blinking on his datapad. After all these years, a summons back to Ulia, back to the place that had changed his life forever. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight. The shelves lining his study were crammed with awards, hollow images, mementos of his illustrious journalism career. But none of it filled the aching void left by Spica's absence, by the trauma of the war he had witnessed. Gary squeezed his eyes shut, memories assaulting him. Smoke and plasma scorched rubble, Spica's blood on his hands as she breathed her last, the haunted eyes of the orphaned younglings. He had done his best to give them a good life on Earth, to shield them from the horrors they had endured. But some scars ran too deep to ever fully heal. His finger hovered over the reply button, hesitating. Going back to Ulia, confronting the ghosts of his past, it was the last thing he wanted to do. But the message urged him to return, hinting at some urgent matter that required his presence. And despite the dread coiling in his gut, Gary knew he couldn't ignore it. He owed it to Spica, to the younglings, to see this through. Mind made up, he began making preparations for the journey. He arranged for his assistant to take over his current assignments, booked passage on a long-haul freighter headed for the Outer Rim. He debated telling the younglings, now almost grown, where he was going. But in the end he decided against it. They had already lost so much. He couldn't bear to get their hopes up, only to potentially dash them once again. The voyage passed in a blur of hyperlanes and restless sleep. Gary spent the long hours poring over his old notes and footage from the war, trying to steel himself for what he might find. But nothing could have prepared him for the devastation that awaited him on Ulia's surface. The once gleaming cities were now little more than bombed-out shells, their soaring towers reduced to jagged stumps. Rubble choked the streets, and the acrid stench of smoke hung heavy in the air. Plasma-charred corpses littered the ground, their faces frozen in rictuses of agony. Gary picked his way through the debris, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had known the insurgency was bad, but this was a nightmare made manifest, a hellscape that made the previous war look like a schoolyard scuffle. Blaster fire split the air, forcing him to dive for cover behind the rusted husk of a ground car. Hunkering down, he risked a glance around the bumper, and felt his blood turn to ice in his veins. A squadron of insurgents, their exoskeletons painted with the jagged sigil of their splinter faction, were advancing down the street, and at their head, barking orders with ruthless efficiency, was a figure he would know anywhere. Spica, she was alive. But as Gary watched her direct her soldiers to tighten their perimeter, watched her cold eyes scan the ruins for any sign of resistance, he realized the Spica he had known and loved was gone. In her place stood a hardened warrior, a rebel commander forged in the crucible of endless conflict. Her once bright carapace was now pitted and scarred, her antennae shorn to ragged stubs. She moved with a predatory grace, a plasma rifle clutched in her upper arms. Gary's mind reeled, unable to reconcile this battle-hardened insurgent with the idealistic young rebel he had known, the Spica who had risked everything to save a handful of innocent younglings, who had sacrificed herself to destroy the data center. How had she survived? And what had happened to her in the intervening years to transform her into this cold-eared soldier? As if sensing his gaze, Speaker's head snapped around, their eyes locked across the rubble-strewn street. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then, slowly, recognition dawned on her angular features. Her mandibles parted in shock. "Gary!" His name on her lips, scarcely more than a whisper. But it was enough. Enough to shatter the numb disbelief that had gripped him, to send him surging to his feet. He stumbled towards her, heedless of the armed rebels who swung their weapons to train on him. "Speaker, I thought, how are you?" He fumbled for words, 1,000 questions tripping over themselves on his tongue. She gestured sharply for her soldiers to lower their rifles, her compound eyes never leaving his face. She took a step towards him, then another. One of her subordinates made a questioning chirp, but she silenced him with a slash of her claw. When she spoke, her voice was rough, scraped raw by the smoke and the years. "I never thought I'd see you again. What are you doing here?" "I got a message, telling me to come back to Ulia. I thought—" He shook his head, struggling to order his chaotic thoughts. "I thought you were dead, Speaker. I watched you die in my arms. How is this possible?" A shadow flickered across her face, some unreadable emotion darkening her eyes. "I was dead, or as good as. After you left, She trailed off, her mandibles clicking in agitation. "It's a long story, one we don't have time for right now. The insurgents—" A plasma blast seared the air next to Gary's head, drowning out the rest of her words. He flinched, ducking instinctively. Spicer whirled, shouting orders to her troops. They scattered, taking up defensive positions behind the rubble. "We have to get out of here." Spiker grabbed Gary's arm, hauling him behind a collapsed wall. Plasma bolts stitched the ground where he'd been standing moments before. "The government forces have us surrounded. We need to break through their lines, get to safety." Gary peeked over the lip of the wall, pulse pounding in his ears. Beyond the ruins he could see heavily armed Ullian soldiers advancing, their exoskeletons gleaming under the harsh sun. They outnumbered Spiker's insurgents at least 3-1. He swallowed hard, trying to quell his rising panic. This wasn't what he had expected when he'd answered that cryptic summons. He was a journalist, not a soldier. He had no business being caught in the middle of a firefight. But as he looked at Spiker, at the fierce determination etched into her battle-scarred face, he knew he couldn't abandon her. Not again. He had failed her once, had left her to die on this war-torn hellscape. He wouldn't make that mistake a second time. He met her gaze, his jaw tightening with resolve. "What do you need me to do?" A flicker of surprise crossed her features, followed by a grim smile. She pressed a spare plasma pistol into his hands, her claws lingering on his fingers. "Stay close to me. Don't take any unnecessary risks. We'll get through this together." Together. The word sent a pang through Gary's chest. He nodded, curling his fingers around the unfamiliar weight of the gun. He had never fired a weapon in combat before, but for Speaker, for the chance to maybe, finally, set things right. He was willing to learn. Plasma scorched the air around them as they ducked and wove through the rubble, Spiker's insurgents laying down covering fire. They leapfrogged from one shattered building to the next, slowly closing the distance to the government lines. Gary's heart hammered against his ribs, his breath coming in ragged gasps. This was insanity, suicide. They were outnumbered, outgunned. What chance did they possibly have? But Spiker fought like a dervish, her rifle spitting plasma with uncanny accuracy. She moved like liquid lightning, all lethal grace and coiled power. Gary watched her in awe, trying his best to keep up, to not be a liability. A cry of pain off to his left, one of the rebels crumpling to the ground, ichor spurting from a wound in his thorax. Gary started towards him, but Spiker grabbed his arm, yanking him back. "Leave him, we can't afford to stop." Gary hesitated, his healer's instincts warring with the need to obey Spiker's command. Then a plasma bolt sizzled past his ear, close enough to scorch his hair, and the decision was made for him. He let Spiker drag him onwards, trying not to think about the rebel bleeding out behind them. They were almost to the edge of the city now, the smoke-stained skyline giving way to blasted scrubland. If they could just make it past the last line of buildings, out into the open where Speaker's ship was waiting. A plasma grenade arced overhead, trailing acrid smoke. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. Gary watched it fall as if in a dream, his limbs moving through molasses. Some distant part of his brain screamed at him to run, to find cover. But he was frozen, rooted to the spot. The grenade detonated, a flash of searing light, a roar of sound and fury. Gary felt himself lifted off his feet, flung through the air like a rag doll. He slammed into a wall, pain exploding through every nerve ending. The world spun sickeningly, his vision tunneling to a narrow point. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard Spica screaming his name. She appeared above him, her face a mask of anguish. He tried to speak, to tell her to run, to save herself. But his tongue was thick and heavy in his mouth, the words slurring into an unintelligible mumble. Darkness crept in at the edges of his vision, and he knew he was slipping away. He had failed her again, had failed the younglings waiting for him back on Earth. He tried to cling to consciousness, but the pull of oblivion was too strong. As his eyes fluttered shut, he felt Speaker's claws close around his hand, heard her mandibles click in a desperate, keening prayer. "Stay with me, Gary, please, I can't lose you again." Then the darkness took him, and he knew no more. If you finished this story, please subscribe and like the video. Then leave a comment that says, "I liked the story," and I will heart every single one of them. It really helps me. Thank you for your time.